Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the other fathers and brother of the Brooklyn Oratory, I would like to welcome you to the 2021 Baronius Lecture. Charged by St. Philip Neri to write a scholarly and honest history of the Church in response to Protestant critics, Cesare Baronius ultimately produced his Annales between 1588 and 1607, which ran to 12 volumes. An early example of modern historiography, his Magnum Opus was described by Lord Acton in the 19th century as, quote, the greatest history of the Church ever written, end quote. In keeping with the spirit and example of Cardinal Baronius, the Brooklyn Oratory has been sponsoring annual lectures in church history under his patronage by inviting scholars from the world over to address topics in church history which can or should be of interest to us today. Past speakers have included Martin Marty of the University of Chicago, who spoke on Philip Neri and Martin Luther, Father Jerry Fogarty, Professor Emeritus of University of Virginia, who spoke on the American government and the Vatican during World War II, the British author Joyce Sugg, who spoke on John Henry Newman, and our most recent speaker in 2019 was Professor Ron Herzman, who spoke on Dante's spiritual journey. Now, for this year's speaker, we're very honored to have Professor Cecilia Moore, and the timing of her lecture and its topic could not be more appropriate, as November, which is just in a few days, is Black Catholic History Month. Born and raised in Danville, Virginia, Professor Moore did her undergraduate studies at Sweetbriar College and earned her PhD at the University of Virginia. She is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, where she teaches courses in U.S. Catholic history and African American religious history. In the summer, she is part of the faculty of the Institute of Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University of Louisiana, which is in New Orleans, where she also teaches Black Catholic history. In addition to publishing articles in numerous scholarly journals, popular magazines, and chapters and books, Dr. Moore has also co-edited Songs of Our Hearts and Meditations of Our Souls, Prayers for Black Catholics. She is also a member of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and the American Catholic Historical Association. Again, we're so honored and glad that Professor Moore has accepted our invitation to speak this year. And as we all know, her topic will be Catholic activism in the civil rights movement by three religious communities in the South. As Professor Moore delivers her talk, please feel free to submit questions in the chat. And after her lecture concludes, she will try to address as many as time may allow. So good evening, welcome, and welcome again, Professor Moore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a good evening to everyone. It's an honor to give this year's Baronius lecture. I want to start by thanking Father Andrassi and the entire Brooklyn Oratory for inviting me to present to you tonight. We've spent time over the past many months planning this talk, Father Andrassi and I, and although we settled on the topic of Catholic involvement in civil rights a while back, the who, when, and where of the focus evolved over our conversations. We finally settled on looking at three different places in the South and the experiences of religious working with African Americans and local communities to advance the work of civil rights in the 1950s and 60s. The places that I'm going to talk about tonight are New Orleans, Rock Hill, South Carolina, and Danville, Virginia. Each of these holds a significant place in the history of the long civil rights movement of the 20th century. The religious who are featured in tonight's talk are the Josephites, the Congregation of the Oratory, the Sisters of Our Lady of Christian Doctrine, and the Society of Christ our King. In sharing some of the history of these places and communities, I hope to remind those of us who lived through those periods of time, the 1950s and the 60s, of the Catholics who were directly engaged in the work for civil rights, and to make aware the many of us who may not be very familiar with this history of these stories. In being reminded and in being made aware, it's my hope that some of what they did might inspire renewed Catholic action and activism for racial justice in our own times. In 1943, the Josephites proposed a high school for African American boys in New Orleans. They reasoned that such a school was needed to meet the educational aspirations of Black boys who attended New Orleans Catholic elementary and middle schools, but who had little opportunity to attend a Catholic high school. Though there were 3 Catholic high schools in New Orleans, none of them that were for boys, none of them admitted Blacks. And although there was one very good Catholic coeducational high school in New Orleans for Blacks, that being Xavier Prep, run by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, it did not have the capacity to educate every Black boy who wanted a Catholic high school education. As one American Catholic religious community of priests and brothers that was entirely devoted to serving the Black community, and as administrators of 9 parishes in New Orleans, the Josephites felt confident that this was a mission they could fulfill. Father Edward V. Casserly, Superior General of the Josephites, proposed the school. And when he proposed the school, he did so from the perspective of having taught at Xavier University of Louisiana and having served in 3 parishes in New Orleans. Over the course of his 15 years of study, his 15 years of work in the city, he had come to know New Orleans Black Catholics, and he respected the hopes they had for their children, especially their sons. So this school that he proposed would prepare Black boys for college and beyond. Less than 10 years later, the Josephites fulfilled their proposal. In August 1951, over 3,000 guests gathered for the dedication of St. Augustine High School in New Orleans' 7th Ward. Among those gathered were Archbishop Rummel, the Superior General of the Josephites, Sisters of the Holy Family, Congregation of the Holy Ghost, and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. These were all religious communities that served in the Black apostolate in New Orleans. There too were proud parents and extended family members, students, and members of the New Orleans Black community at large. They gathered to celebrate the promise that the education and formation of St. Augustine students that this school offered. They believed that what the positive things that would happen in the lives of these young men who graduated from the school would redound to the whole community. The school came to be known as St. Aug's, and its students St. Aug's men. The overwhelming majority of St. Aug's students in the 1960s were from the middle class. They were middle-class Black Catholic boys. Great expectations, however, rested on their shoulders as they endeavored to, quote, prove their work academically, physically, emotionally, morally, and spiritually, and to develop an unshakable self-understanding that they were, quote, as good as anyone else, end quote. By 1960, St. Aug's had become a center of civil rights activism in the Crescent City. Sidney Barthelemy, an alumnus of the class of 1960, recalled, quote, "The school always talked to us about leadership and that we had the responsibility because we were blessed with a good education to improve the community and get involved. There was a definite motive, philosophy, and theme in the school that segregation was unjust and we had to do what we could to change it, end quote. Alumni of St. Aug's remembered that the Josephites taught them how to, quote, use the system to work for change, and that working for civil rights would, quote, take on aspects of a political struggle, end quote. Father Eugene McManus turned his civics class into a course on politics because he believed that until Blacks gained political power, they would never truly be free. And for that to happen, they needed to become voters. Father McManus addressed parishioners at the Josephite parishes about voting and insisted that until Black parents became voters, they could not give their children, quote, a future with dignity, end quote. St. Aug's School became a site for teaching people how to register to vote, and it also prepared Blacks to take the, quote, voting test that they had to pass in order to register to vote. To assist in this work, Father McManus and John Williams, a Black lay Catholic, wrote a pamphlet titled How to Register. In his 1996 autobiography, Fighting the Lamb's War, Skirmishes with the American Empire, Philip Berrigan said of himself, quote, I was a racist when I arrived at St. Augustine's, because to live in America is to be racist, either by commission or omission, end quote. And even though he was formed to serve as a priest in the Black community, he said he did not realize this about himself until he met students at St. Aug's. He said, quote, the students of St. Augustine continued my education, gently but firmly healing my blindness, end quote. From 1956 to 1963, Berrigan taught English and religion at St. Aug's. As gently as he says his students taught him about racism, he was not always particularly gentle with them. One of his former students, Roy Naboon, recalled that Berrigan told them often they could either be chumps or champs. Champs did the right thing always, no matter what, even if they lost. But chumps regarded themselves as, quote, victims and complained, but did not try to change their circumstances. He taught them that Christianity was an activist religion. If you saw something that was wrong as a Christian, you were responsible to try to make it right. You didn't, quote, just sit on your backsides and pray, end quote. He taught them to be aggressive pacifists. As sponsor of the sodality at St. Aug's, Berrigan helped St. Aug's students develop a tutoring program for children who lived in the St. Bernard Project, and also arranged for them to attend civil rights demonstrations in downtown New Orleans with the permission of their parents. Berrigan saw himself as teaching the young men, quote, a theology of contribution and involvement, end quote. The longer he stayed in New Orleans teaching at St. Aug's, the more radical he became, and the more vocal he became also in identifying racism, quote, as a white problem, not a Black one, end quote. Later in life, he recalled his years at St. Augustine High School as the beginning of his, quote, lifelong study of the connections between militarism, racism, and poverty, end quote. McManus, Berrigan, and other Josephites who taught at St. Aug's and used that time to bring their students and also their religious community into direct action for civil rights. This quality of the St. Aug's teachers in the 1950s and 60s represented somewhat of a departure from the traditional approach of the Josephites, who had placed a greater emphasis on spiritual work and a hesitancy to get involved in political social action. The first U.S. foundation of the Congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri was made in 1935, when 22 men from New York, led by Father Paul Hatch, established an oratory in Rock Hill, South Carolina. When seeking a home for their oratory, Father Hatch sent letters to bishops throughout the United States, but he received just one receptive response. It came from Bishop Emmett Walsh of the Diocese of Charleston. The diocese was vast. Outside of Charleston, the number of Catholics in the diocese was few, and the other Catholics in the diocese were scattered far and wide. Knowing that the Oratorians were dedicated to serving the poor and sharing the Catholic faith, he was glad to accept their help and to give them a large territory spanning 5 counties to care for. With South Carolina being a state with a significant population of African Americans, many of whom were poor, without a doubt, the Oratorians would certainly minister to Blacks, but not exclusively to them. In fact, their first ministry in Rock Hill was to white Catholics when they took responsibility for St. Anne Catholic Church not long after they arrived. But by the early 1940s, they were already working directly in Rock Hill's Black community. First attempting a school library church for Black children with donations from a wealthy New York donor. While that endeavor didn't go as planned, they continued to build relationships within the Black community with Black Catholics, with other Catholics of color, with Black Protestants, both laity and clergy. Now, when the newly ordained Oratorian, Father Edward Walsh, was assigned to Rock Hill, he was assigned to work expressly with the Blacks. And he began his ministry by visiting the sick and distributing Catholic and secular literature on home visits. He definitely wanted to start a church for Blacks in Rock Hill, but he thought what they needed more was a recreation center. And he felt this way because there was really nothing in the town for Black youth to do. Everything essentially was, they were excluded from everything because of race. So he really believed in this recreation center. When he approached Bishop Walsh about creating a church and recreation center for African Americans, he got an immediate go-ahead for the church, but it took some time to get the bishop to agree to the rec center. But ultimately, that was approved too. Both the church, St. Mary's, that was the name of the church, and the rec center, Blessed Martin de Porres Recreation Center, were dedicated in 1946. The children of the community, of course, loved the recreation center, and soon the church became a place not only of worship and devotion, but also of social and political action. As Blacks, both those who were Catholic and those who were not Catholic, found in St. Mary's a safe, productive place to strategize and act for civil rights, and they found among the Oratorians some priests and brothers that they believed would be good allies in the cause. In 1954, the Oratorians invited the Sisters of Our Lady of Christian Doctrine to work with them at St. Mary's. The mission of the Sisters of Christian Doctrine aligned closely with that of the Oratorians, and they served with them in Rock Hill from 1955 to 1978. At St. Mary's, the Sisters of Christian Doctrine sponsored a kindergarten, which helped give Black children in the community an educational head start, and it also gave Black working mothers a safe, enriching place to leave their children while they worked. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the Oratorians and the Sisters of Christian Doctrine directly and indirectly participated in and supported a variety of civil rights actions in Rock Hill, beginning with publishing articles supportive of civil rights in the parish newsletter, Common Sense, to joining and supporting national civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, CORE, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and also the Catholic Interracial Council. By the fall of 1954, St. Anne's Catholic School, the parish school of the white parish in Rock Hill, integrated, making it the first school of any kind in South Carolina to integrate. This was just a few months after the landmark Brown decision. In 1957, the Oratorians put their weight behind a bus boycott in Rock Hill by soliciting donations from their benefactors to provide transportation for Blacks. Brother David Boone helped train students from Friendship College. That was an African-American junior college in Rock Hill. He helped train students from Friendship College in nonviolent disobedience skills in preparation for the sit-ins and marches they held in 1961 to end segregation and racial discrimination in Rock Hill's stores and restaurants. He also assisted when the first group of Freedom Riders were attacked in the summer of 1961 in Rock Hill. And like the Josephites, the Oratorians and the Sisters of Christian Doctrine also became involved in voter registration initiatives in the community. The Society of Christ Our King was a missionary community dedicated to ministering to the temporal and spiritual needs of all people, regardless of race or religion. It took its motto from Pope Pius XI's 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. Members pledged themselves to, quote, the reform of the social order and to reconstructing society in Christ. In 1938, the Society of Christ Our King relocated from North Carolina to Danville, Virginia. With the help of some friends in the city, the Society bought a large house on Main Street, just across from the Sutherland Mansion, which had served as the last capital of the Confederacy. Once in Danville, the sisters established relationships with the Catholic community, but their primary mission was to reach out to people who were not Catholic and to serve the poor. Hence, they focused their attention on poor Blacks and whites in Danville and in the surrounding area. They fed the hungry, took care of the sick, ran a school for disabled children, taught Sunday school at Sacred Heart Church, assisted people in finding employment, and did whatever else they could to improve life for poor Danvillians. For many Danvillians, the sisters were the face of Catholicism. Over their years in the city, they earned the respect and admiration of a wide cross-section of its citizens. On February 2nd, 1943, a Connecticut Yankee on her father's side and an Irish Catholic on her mother's, Leona Card entered the Society of Christ Our King after graduating from Laurelton Hall in Milford, Connecticut. Her brother Jim accompanied her on a train bound for Danville. Mother Teresa, the leader of the society, met the Cards at the train station, where Jim informed Mother Teresa that his sister was a good pie baker and a good driver, skills that would serve the society and civil rights workers particularly well in 1963, when the sisters dedicated themselves to working for civil rights in Danville. Upon seeing his sister settled in, Jim had to return home to Connecticut. and Leona was allowed to take him to the train station. While waiting for his train, the Cards sat down inside the station. But not long after seating themselves, a woman rushed over and told them to move to the other side because they were sitting in the Negro section. This was their first experience with racial segregation, and they were really dumbfounded by it. Recalling her feelings about it many years later, Card said, quote, "Danville was a foreign country. She would learn that in Danville there were races and classes and permutations of both, and one did best not to challenge the boundaries or the permutations." Though this troubled her, Card was answering her vocation. She said, "It was Jesus. Come and see," Jesus said. "He wanted me to trust him completely." The call was to come to the Society of Christ our King and to Danville. In Danville, Leona became Sister Rosalie, and with her sisters, she would spend the next 25 years working to reconstruct society in Christ. In the late 1940s, the Society of Christ our King moved to an 80-acre farm on the outskirts of Danville. They called their new convent and farm Lynn Regis. Lynn Regis would figure prominently in Danville civil rights activism in the spring and summer of 1963, when the sisters opened their home and grounds up to civil rights workers who were organizing and demonstrating in Danville. In the spring and summer of 1963, the Danville Christian Progressive Association, DCPA, organized and led civil rights demonstrations in Danville. The DCPA received assistance from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in training Danville demonstrators, many of whom were school children, and clapping, singing, mass marching, nonviolent resistance, and chanting. Their hope was to make progress in ending racial discrimination in hiring, in ending segregation in employment, and in extending voting rights to all citizens of Danville. In spite of the 1954 Brown v. Board civil rights victory, Danville still rigidly enforced racial segregation. Its schools, except for the Catholic school in Danville, Sacred Heart Catholic School, were still all segregated. The city government did not hire Blacks, nor did downtown stores, and parks and public facilities remained segregated. The DCPA held its first demonstration in downtown Danville on May 31st. They led religious congregations and students to City Hall to call for equality in hiring practices. Daily demonstrations lasted until June 5th, 1963, when exasperated city leaders dredged up an antebellum Virginia statute that prohibited the incitement of, quote, "the colored population to acts of violence and war against the white population," end quote. Demonstrators were charged with inciting riot, and because many were school children, there was also the charge of inciting or encouraging a minor to commit a misdemeanor. This began a string of arrests and imprisonment of demonstrators, including children, and even parents of demonstrators. The kids' parents who were not at the demonstrations, some of them were also arrested. Judge Archibald Aiken issued a temporary injunction and restraining order barring any singing, marching, or public demonstration without a parade permit. None of this was covered in the Danville papers, and nothing would be reported until the Associated Press got wind of what was happening in Danville and threatened to cut the wire service to the city. As the civil rights movement got going, Mother Teresa of the Society of Christ our King kept her sisters informed of what was going on. She told them about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and anything that was being done to help Blacks gain their rights in the United States. The society saw in the civil rights movement a true living out of their mission to, quote, reconstruct society in Christ. Card recalled, quote, we were committed to bringing Christ to society, and there was Rosa Parks doing it for us in Montgomery, end quote. Long known as a friend of the Black community, when the civil rights movement came to Danville in full force in 1963, the Reverend Lawrence Campbell, who was then pastor of Bible Way Church and a member of the DCPA, invited Mother Teresa to come to his church to speak to the youth who were involved in the demonstrations in Danville. He told her they were losing heart, and he also informed Mother Teresa that papers in Danville were refusing to let any news of civil rights demonstrations get out of the city. The sisters volunteered to type articles about what was happening in Danville and to send them to the Associated Press so that the wire service could pick them up Mother Teresa also agreed to come to Reverend Campbell's church to address the children of the movement. At Bible Way, Mother Teresa, quote, assured the youngsters that it was necessary to demonstrate because to demonstrate was to teach. And she told them they were teaching, quote, responsible Christian people about the evils of segregation, and in doing so, were changing society for the better. While at church that night, Reverend Campbell asked Mother Teresa if she would join the demonstration the next day at the Danville courthouse. Not knowing that her remarks were being aired on the radio, Mother Teresa told Reverend Campbell she would do what she could. Upon returning to her convent, she received a phone call from a prominent Catholic woman in Danville who urged her to stay away from the Black ministers and their movement. She warned Mother Teresa she was ruining her good name and putting in jeopardy the respect that it had taken years for the society to earn in Danville. Card reported that Mother Teresa replied she didn't care about losing their respect or ruining her reputation, but what she was really afraid of was doing what was unchristian. And fundamentally, supporting civil rights for Blacks and opposing segregation was Christian. Recalling this time in history and the sisters' role in it, Reverend Campbell, who is now Bishop Campbell, said, quote, they were disturbed by the injustice in the society and felt there was a role they could play in helping extract Black people from the tyranny of racism, end quote. The next afternoon, Mother Teresa and Sister Leona joined demonstrators on the steps of the Danville courthouse. They held a sign that declared, segregation is inherently evil, while young demonstrators prayed and sang. This was the sisters' first and last public demonstration against segregation, because when the Bishop of Richmond, John J. Russell, received word of their participation, he forbade them from any future demonstrations. Though sympathetic to the cause of civil rights, Bishop Russell did not want priests and sisters involved in public demonstrations, but he did give the society permission to help in other ways, including opening their convent to civil rights demonstrators. All through the summer of 1963, the Society of Christ Our King hosted Black and white civil rights demonstrators from Danville and all around the country in their convent, Lynn Regis. Card recalled that although some Danville Catholics weren't happy about it, some respected the sisters and were proud to see Catholic allies working in Danville, working for racial justice. Not long after the sisters' demonstration, Bishop Russell issued a pastoral letter to the Diocese of Richmond, clearly stating his support for the civil rights movement. He reminded his people of their, quote, obligation in fraternal charity and racial justice, quote, end quote, to support the aims of the movement. And he called on Catholics to use Christian principles to work with, quote, our fellow citizens of other faiths for the cause of racial justice and Christian charity, end quote. Russell's pastoral on civil rights was published in the diocesan paper, the Catholic Virginian, and the bishop ordered it be read in every church in the diocese. On June 10th, 1963, Danville experienced Bloody Monday. That evening, civil rights demonstrators gathered in the city jail, at the city jail to pray for imprisoned demonstrators. What began as a peaceful and prayerful gathering did not remain that way for long. Claiming that this gathering defied the injunction against parading, city police deputized city sanitation workers on the spot and enlisted their help in beating and arresting those praying. The police also turned high water pressure hoses on the demonstrators. 38 were arrested that night and over 40 people were beaten and treated at the Winslow Hospital, which was Danville's Black hospital that night. Police claimed that the protesters started the altercation by spitting on them and wielding ice picks and baseball bats and other weapons. Such was reported in the Richmond Leader. Immediately, word of this got out to the national press and to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Press and supporters poured into Danville. Dr. King promised he would come back to Danville. He had already been to Danville a couple of times. He would return because Bloody Monday was, quote, the worst case of police brutality, end quote, yet seen by the movement. Heartened by the support, the DCPA now had to find housing for civil rights volunteers who were coming to Danville from around the country. The DCPA planned to house out-of-town demonstrators in the homes of Danvillians who supported the movement, most of whom were Black. When the city got word of this, they passed an injunction making it illegal for Blacks and whites to stay together, even in private homes. Where would they go? Well, many would find welcome and rest with the Society of Christ our King at Lynn Regis. The society received young people, most of whom were Methodist, Baptist, and Jewish, and some of whom were also socialist, as guests. They provided them with good food and a place to plan, teach, organize, and also a bucolic respite from the struggle. Later that summer, the DCPA planned a Mother's March and invited Mother Teresa to participate. But because Bishop Russell had forbade the sisters from participating in public demonstrations, she had to decline. Wanting there to be Catholic representation at the march, Mother Teresa contacted Dorothy Day and asked her to represent the Catholic Church at the march. Day agreed. Upon arriving at Lynn Regis, Day dined with the SNCC volunteers at the convent. Quote, we ate the good farm products. There were steak and hot dogs besides, and students told me of the happenings in Danville, stories of which had been publicized all over the country, but they could still scarcely convey the horror or brutality which had been inflicted on a helpless, unarmed crowd of demonstrators, end quote. Day attended a mass meeting that night at one of the churches in Danville, where she said, quote, the singing lifted the heart, strengthened the knees, end quote. The next day, she joined a small group of women demonstrators who picketed downtown Danville, July 10th, 1963. Day had the opportunity to speak with, quote, the very young among the Negro students who led the way in integration. And she was fascinated to hear them, quote, talk of the work and struggle ahead. Decades later, when I asked Bishop Campbell why the Society of Christ our King and its role in assisting the civil rights movement in Danville was not recorded anywhere, Bishop Campbell replied, I think the sisters are not mentioned because they were supportive. They did not seek the limelight. They intentionally chose to do things that would not bring attention to themselves, but that would advance the cause of the movement, end quote. So I've told you 3 different stories about Catholic religious in the South. I think that there are a couple of things that they have in common. And I just want to point them out really quickly. I know I don't have a lot of time left, but
No, you do. I just came back on. I don't want to rush you at all, please.
that's okay. Well, I just have 3. I have just 3 observations, and
Please,
maybe
go
people
ahead,
will want to
please.
talk about them. I don't know. The first thing that I think makes holds these stories together is that all of these communities had a charism or a mission that committed them to being directly engaged with the poor and disenfranchised. And one of them was completely dedicated to the Black apostolate, that being, of course, the Josephites. To fulfill their mission, there was hardly any way that they could not have become involved in working for civil rights for Blacks, because that touched every aspect of who they were called to be. Second, they were all willing to become involved with Black leaders, organizations, and institutions as people who could do something to contribute to the cause. None of them strove to become the leader. I think that's an important thing. And they were all remarkably ecumenical way before we get the decree on ecumenism. And finally, they took the time to learn from Black people what mattered to Black people, what their real life experiences were. And then once they had some understanding, they found the places in the movement where they could be effective and do something positive. And I think that those attributes of these people in that time are things that those of us who are feeling like we want to do something today to continue the work of dismantling racism, which sadly is still with us, I think looking at their attributes and trying to find those within ourselves, I think is really a great place for people who want to do something positive today to start. So that is my presentation for you. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to engage you all in some conversation.
Thanks so much, Professor Moore. I think we have a couple of, and I'm not sure if you can see them, so I'll read the first one to you.
Yeah.
Anne, thanks. Can you read it? Can you see it or no?
I see, yes.
Okay.
I'm wondering, do you mean, oh, okay, I'm not sure. Can you hear, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the question from Professor Clement is, I'm wondering to what extent the efforts of Black Catholics in the South involve cooperation with non-Catholics. Definitely they had to be involved because there were not a whole lot of Black Catholics in the South. And the thing that the Black Catholics shared with those Blacks who weren't Catholic was that they shared the same experience. And you know, whether we're thinking about the children in Rock Castle, most of whom were not Catholic, who came to the church and to the recreation center, who were whose families were poor and who did struggle, or if we're thinking about the boys who went to St. Aug's, those middle class Black Catholic boys, it didn't really matter what your social class was if you were Black at that time. you were all segregated. Those laws applied. It didn't matter what your level of education was, what your beliefs were. It didn't matter. So all Blacks were involved in this fight together. And one of the stories that I really like that's not part of tonight's story is about a Black Catholic lawyer in New Orleans, who's very well known in New Orleans. He's well known in civil rights history, A.P. Turow, who he was one of the NAACP lawyers who was part of the strategy to legally dismantle Jim Crow. And you can see in the work of, Turow was a deeply Catholic man, but he was also deeply ecumenical because he was fighting for civil rights. And that's something I love about the civil rights movement, is that it always was ecumenical. So I hope that might answer your question.
Professor Moore, there's another question from Jimmy Simmons. The school St. Aug's, were there comparable schools like that around the country that were educating Black middle-class boys and girls, or maybe even poorer ones?
I know that the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, they sponsored all sorts of schools. And their schools were in the Midwest, the South. They were in the somewhere in the North, but mostly they were working in the South. The first two schools that, among the first two schools that Catherine Drexel sponsored for African Americans, because she also did schools for Native Americans, were these two boarding schools. St. Emma's, which you might think would be the girls' school, but that was the boys the boys' vocational and military school. It was a military academy, and that school took all sorts of boys too. But as it was a boarding school, you would find a lot of middle class and upper class kids at that school. And then she had a girls' school, St. Francis, which was the girls' boarding school. And again, she took all sorts of Black girls could go to the school, but there were a lot of upper class, middle class girls who went to those schools. And those schools, ironically, were she bought a former plantation, and those schools were located on these plantations in Virginia. So yes, there were other schools. Okay, would you speak a bit more about the integration of Catholic schools under Jim Crow? Yes, I think that's another really interesting part of the history. One of the things that we would see, and there was no national Catholic plan for integration. We did not have that. What we had was, in different places, local groups making decisions to integrate their schools, so these private Catholic schools that decided to integrate schools. And then in terms of parochial schools, dioceses deciding, or the bishops of dioceses deciding to integrate schools. And another story that I've worked with that I really like a lot is out here in the Midwest where I am. And that's the story of Cardinal Ritter, who in 1938 integrated the parochial schools in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. And then a few years later, when he went to St. Louis, he integrated them in St. Louis as well. And neither time was it done without controversy. But when you would have someone like Ritter do that, it gave other bishops the, I don't know if I would say courage, but maybe it was courage. It would give them, you would notice that others would start to do it. I'll put it that way. And in 1953, in North Carolina, in the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina, Bishop Vincent Waters, he began integrating schools. So he's working on that a year before Brown too. So, and Catholics were regarded as leaders on that issue of integration in terms of the schools. Even though when we look at the history, we can see that's spotty and it took a long time for some to do it, but you do have some early examples. And one of the things that is part of the big, like, I think of it as like this huge basket of stuff that the NAACP lawyers accomplish all around the country, that like it's this overwhelming amount of legal weight that brings Jim Crow down in terms of the decision of Brown. And within that basket was the example of places in the United States where Catholic schools had integrated. And as I always say in my class, and it's not quoting anything, I just think it sounds good. You know what? These Catholic schools like in Indianapolis, St. Louis, integrated, and we didn't go to hell in a handbasket. And I think that was really good, evidence that, this is not going to mangle the minds and souls of children if Black kids and white kids and the other children too are all in school together. Okay. Let's see if I see anything else in the chat.
Professor Moore, obviously I can't help but recognize that you're from Danville and those sisters. Mm-hmm. So would you have known any of those sisters as you were growing up?
Okay, I did not. I think I've got time to tell my little story about that, because this is one of the things that I've written. It's one of the things I'm most proud of, because I really felt when I heard about this, it made me want to make sure that their story got recorded. I was finishing my dissertation the summer that Sister Leona Card came to visit. It was I think it was her 40th or 50th. It was some big anniversary in religious life, because her community did not survive. And she ended up becoming a Franciscan out in Denver. And she, for that Jubilee, she wanted to come to Danville to visit her friends. And one of the friends she wanted to come see was my mother, who was befriended by these sisters when she converted to Catholicism in the 50s. And my mother spent a lot of time with them. But by the time we got to the 1960s, when civil rights movement was going on, my parents were married and were having a bunch of children. So my mom was not involved with them during that time, but they remained friends over the years. And so when I came home one day from trying to finish my dissertation from the library, my mother is like, "Oh, I wish you had been here," because my friend Sister Leona Card was here. And I said, "Well, who is she?" And my mother told me, and I said, I wrote her name down. I wrote that she had been involved in civil rights, and on like a little card. And I was like, one day I'm gonna like do this. Well, about, I'd say 6 years later, I found the card and I was like, I need to do this. So I called her up, and that's how I started, interviewing her. And I told her, I said, "Sister, I want to write this story." I said, "But I've got to be able to find documents to verify the things you're telling me." And I found, for everything that Sister told me, I found sources outside of her testimony, which I trusted, but we need our documents. I found them. And one of the things that I loved the best was the Dorothy Day Story. And I was trying so hard to verify it. And one of my colleagues here at UD, who spent time as a Catholic worker, she she said, Cecilia, I think I read something about Dorothy Day being in Danville. And I was like, you did? And she's like, yeah. And I said, well, can you give that to me? And there it was. And I was like, wow. And then about 10 years after I wrote this article, another person who works on this Danville civil rights history, she said, Cecilia, I have a picture, I think it's Dorothy Day, but I'm not really sure. She said, I found it in this horrible collection of horribly racist material that we have in the Danville, Historical Society. She said, but I think it's Dorothy Day. And so I don't know why this horrible racist would have had this picture, but she showed me. I was like, yeah, that's Dorothy Day. So, I got her own testimony that yes, that she was there, and then the picture. So, yeah, I was very happy that I was able to write about them. So
There may be time for one more, and then I'd like to close if it's okay, Cecilia, with a question for you.
I can't.
Who administers these schools now?
Who administers these schools? Okay. The Josephites still run St. Aug's, and St. Aug's has I know a lot of St. Aug's graduates who are wonderful people, but there are a lot of well-known people who graduated from St. Aug's, including, if you watch the Colbert, Stephen Colbert's show, his music guy, John Baptiste, he's a graduate of St. Aug's. So they still have St. Aug's in New Orleans. I don't know if St. Anne's School is still operating. I'm not sure about that. In Danville, we had a Catholic school and we still have it. And we don't have sisters at our school. And the Society of Christ Our King never taught at the Sacred Heart School. We had Sisters of Mercy and Franciscan sisters, but now it's run by lay people. So some of these schools are still going.
Cecilia, could I put you on the spot to talk about the work you're doing to update Cyprian Davis's book? I'm sure the people here would love to hear about that, if you don't mind speaking about that.
Yeah, I can say a little bit. Father Cyprian Davis as a huge mentor for me, and we became friends over the years. We taught together at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies, and Father died in 2015. At that time, he was adding some new chapters to his history of Black Catholics in the United States and doing some updates. And he asked me if I would work with him on those additions that he was making. And he passed away. He didn't. Not long after he asked me if I would work with him, he died. And so I'm getting closer. I'm still not done with the revisions that Father Cyprian began, but I can just say that there is a significant amount of work in the revised book on civil rights, Black Catholics in particular in the civil rights movement, and also more on the experiences of contemplatives, Black contemplatives, and also a chapter looking at Black Catholics shaping American culture. So that's what I'm trying to finish. And I'm praying that I'm getting very close because a lot of people ask me about it a lot, and I hate to tell them I'm still working on it, but I am still working on it.
Well, I didn't. I hope I didn't mean to put it that way.
That's just the truth of the matter.
I think for some of the people on the Zoom, just to know about Father Davis is kind of,
Mhm.
it's the single best book, one book on the history of Black. I was looking around because I know I have it on one of my shelves here, but of course I can't find it right now. I was going to hold it up. It was written in like maybe the late 80s. Is that right? Late 80s, early
He
90s?
published it in 1990. He published
Okay.
it in 1990, and he worked for many years on the book. And yes, it's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book the way that it is. But he wanted to add some things that he had learned and done more research on. And the wonderful thing about Father's book is that it's generated a lot of other scholarship. It's generated a lot of other scholarship. So many of the things that he wrote about in the chapters that are in the original book, other people have picked up and have written other wonderful articles and books about. So he did a wonderful thing by writing the book itself, but he did probably an even more wonderful thing by encouraging others to look at this history and to start writing about it too. So,
It actually looks like Father Mark from the Brooklyn Oratory here said he was at St. Anne's recently in Rock Hill, and the school is still going. So that's good news.
Okay, that's good. And I want to say this. I'm really thankful to I was not able to do any archival research on Rock Hill, but I did find a master's thesis that was written not that long ago by a woman named Sandra Lidwa, and that master's thesis was very helpful to me in writing about them for this presentation today. And I'm also grateful to Professor Clement for making me aware of an article that she wrote about the Berrigans and their thoughts about race. And just, we have so many great resources and wonderful people who share their work. And so feel very lucky.
Well, Professor Moore, we can't thank you enough for your time. And I know you worked on this over the summer. And while we were not able to meet you in person, I guess one of the, we're looking for positive things nowadays. This lecture we can share. Obviously, I'll send you a link to it so you can share with whoever.
Please do. Yeah, I'd love to share it with people. And thank you again for inviting me. I don't know when I'll make it to New York, but the next time I come to New York,
you
I'm
have
going
to
to give you a call.
You have to visit. There's no.
I would really love to visit, and it was nice for me to get to learn because I didn't do a deep study, but I did do some reading about the history of your religious community, and so I feel like I got to learn some more great Catholic history from you, from your invitation. I like knowing that the Venerable Cesare Baronius is the father of modern church history.
Yeah, so yes.
I was like, oh, that's who he is. So that was great to learn. So.
Well, we're the richer for your sharing with us tonight, your time with us, Professor Moore. Thank you. And know you have friends in Brooklyn, and when you visit, you have to visit us.
Yes, no, okay? I will. Thank you.
Have a great evening. God bless everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Bye.
Bye.